Alrighty. Well, over these last few weeks in the PM service, we've been working our way through some of the Psalms. Something I'm acutely aware of is, particularly here in Alice Springs, chatting to people, something that often feels like it's lacking is rest. It's like whether our lives are deep or wide. And by that I mean sometimes we feel like we've got our hands in a lot of different places. We've got a lot of commitments, and so we're constantly moving from one thing to another. And that might be your experience. For other people, you do a few things, but you do them really, really deep. They take a lot of emotional energy. They take potentially a lot of spiritual energy, depending upon the work that you do. And whether it be deep or wide, what we can end up with is a genuine, expressed, integrated faith that is beautiful as we express it, but sometimes feels like it's just lacking its sustainability. It feels like our kind of pool of resource, of spiritual resource, is slowly emptying. Unless we can find those places of rest and abiding and renewal, we can sometimes even be worried about the state of our faith. And so this series has been looking at the Psalms and looking at that kind of core human cry that comes out of the Psalms as we reflect upon not only our relationship with God, but the actual human condition that we experience. And the Psalms is full of reflections on the human condition. It's always reflecting of that heart that is either lamenting or praising or crying out. Every emotion in the human spectrum, I think you can find within a psalm somewhere. And tonight is no exception, except this psalm is one that is very, very familiar to many of us. Psalm 23. In fact, it is almost like the typical psalm. When people think of the Psalms, even those people who maybe don't necessarily identify as a Christian, when you use the word psalm, they'll often be able to identify at least a little bit of Psalm 23. And for that reason, sometimes when we explore and encounter these psalms, they can kind of wash over us. I've heard it all before. But tonight, I want to dig in a little bit deeper into Psalm 23. And I've been kind of personally revisiting this psalm quite a bit recently in my role as a pastor, and the pastor means a shepherd, as I consider what it looks like to follow God's example as I kind of shape my expression of faith and shape my role. And as I've kind of dug more and more into the concept of shepherding, I've discovered this fresh revelation of what it meant perhaps to the people at the time and what it means for us as people of the desert. And I say that with reference to the fact that we're here in Central Australia. I mean, you might be joining us online from somewhere else, but here in Alice Springs, we are people of the desert. We experience life in a different way. When people come to Alice Springs, often it actually does something to their faith. We hope a positive thing. And there's a reason for that I think that tonight's message will unpack a little bit. Because sometimes we approach, I believe, Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. And we read this psalm in such a familiar way, and it's always been this psalm of immense hope and encouragement, and that's not going to change. But sometimes it can almost feel a little idealistic. He lets me lie down in green pastures and leads me beside still waters. And we say these words and we speak hope in them, but at the same time, sometimes it feels contrary to our lived experience. It feels aspirational rather than real. And so tonight I want to explore this psalm in a new way, in the hope that maybe for you, this psalm will once again allow you to find rest and find renewal and find a trust in our Creator. And I'm only going to be focusing on the first 4 verses of Psalm 23 tonight, just so you're aware of that as well. I know there are 6 verses, but we're going with the first 4 in terms of tonight. So here it is. Psalm 23. This is the New Living Translation. The Lord is my shepherd. I have all that I need. He lets me rest in green meadows. He leads me beside peaceful streams. He renews my strength. He guides me along right paths, bringing honor to his name. Even when I walk through the dark valley of death, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me. These really familiar words to us, this image of the shepherd, which of course Jesus picks up on significantly in the New Testament as he refers to himself as the good shepherd. This idea of the shepherd is a theme that runs all the way through the scriptures. Now, the thing that we sometimes don't understand because of the images that we carry around shepherding is how deeply shepherding is connected to desert experience. I don't know about you, when I think of shepherds in terms of my experience and what I've seen, I remember flying into New Zealand, right? And you see the rolling green pastures and all the sheep everywhere, right? And you got this like thick, lush grass and it's beautiful. And of course, there's just so many sheep. And I grew up in rural Victoria and we had rolling green hills. And so the idea of pasture being beautiful and green and delightful is very, very familiar to me. But actually, in a biblical context, the concept of shepherding is far more connected with the desert kind of image. And it actually comes back to this actual word in Hebrew, which is, we would write it as DBR, because there aren't vowels in Hebrew in the way that we understand them, DBR. And so deber, or debar, we're going to add some vowels in there just so we can pronounce it. This is kind of a root word in Hebrew that kind of produces this tree of other words. So in Western thinking, when it comes to words, we like words and definitions, right? This word means this. In the Hebrew mind, a word is a picture, okay? And what it does is it sprouts off all these other connected pictures, which is why there are so few Hebrew words in compared to, for example, the English language. And this DBR, deber, or debar, right, is connected, the root word of all these particular words right here. Debar means word, okay? And when we talk about word, we're talking about the word that is used for, say, the 10 commandments, the 10 words, okay? So word is connected there, dabar, D-B-R. Midbar means desert. Now the M, even though it looks like a consonant, is actually a modifying consonant, so it's a little tricky. You can kind of add M's in there and get away with it. But midbar means desert. Again, that D-B-R. Dibur means to speak. To speak. Madbir means shepherd. Dob-er means pasture. And dibir means sheepfold. So while sometimes we kind of carry this image of shepherding being in this kind of lush, green pasture, actually what we actually have in the scriptures is far more a connection between the shepherd and the desert. We've got a connection between the sheepfold and the pasture and word. We've got this connection between the shepherd who speaks in the desert. And so this is really, really significant. And of course, when you start to kind of unpack this and you think about the Bible, it actually begins to make sense, right? I mean, let's think about Moses. What did he do before he was called? He was a shepherd in the desert for 40 years. What was King David as a child? He was a shepherd. The prophet Elijah went out in the desert to hear a word from God. Even Jesus in his own temptation, when he went out into the wilderness for 40 days, where did he go in order to hear God's word? He went out to the desert, right? And so for us, while we don't naturally see it, it's important to understand that the desert and this idea of shepherd are intimately connected, okay? Intimately connected. And this not only reframes how we kind of understand our relationship between the shepherd being God and us, his sheep, in this Psalm 23. I believe, again, it speaks into our context uniquely here in Alice Springs as people of the desert, right? Because it's often in the space of the desert, the midbar, that you receive a fresh word, dabar, right? It's often in the desert that God speaks. This is what we see throughout the Bible, right? And so it should not surprise us that when we separate ourselves, right, from the busyness and the bustle and we move out into these places, that our shepherd who speaks words to us, dibber, 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 you can hear it, right, would speak to us in the desert. And so with that in mind, let's have a look again at this psalm. The Lord is my shepherd, I have all that I need. He lets me rest in green meadows. He leads me beside peaceful streams. And again, I love the way the translators, particularly over time, have kind of expanded this imagery. It's been really, really fascinating, right? Again, you got this kind of thick green grass, this flowing river. I imagine that when you look at these kind of words here, resting in green meadows and beside peaceful streams, you might get an image that looks a little bit like this. Right? Lush green pastures, flowing water. And over time, actually, if you look back at Bible translations, they've actually come to reflect this kind of imagery more and more, right? And I can understand that, right? Because there's something beautiful about there. There's something kind of, there's so much, there's an abundance mentality to this. I mean, look at these green pastures. I mean, look at these flowing waters, right? But if we actually place the psalm back in its original context, this is simply not where shepherding would take place in this kind of context at all. Any rare areas near flowing water, and they were rare, but they were far too valuable to be used for shepherding, right? So if you actually had access to flowing water, you wouldn't be shepherding there, okay? If we're to place this psalm back in its original context, this is what shepherding would look like. This is shepherding in the desert, all right? And so what we have is desert. We have voice. We have deber or pasture. That is what we are looking at there. These small tufts of grass that go over the desert, and if the sun hits at just the right angle, it looks a little bit green. That is the green pasture. Let's talk about water, right? You would notice that this talks about flowing water. In earlier translations, even in the NIV, it says still water. Still water, you might be familiar with that. He leads me beside still waters. That's a far better and accurate translation. Because in the desert, the still water is the remnant and the leftover from the rain. It wasn't a flowing stream. I mean, it's a beautiful image. I'm not saying it's wrong. And believe me, I'm not trying to downplay the significance of God's providence. I'll bring it back around, don't worry. But if we're talking about still waters in the desert, at some point it has rained. And what's left? Still water. These little puddles of still water that we're providing for the sheep. Now, again, I don't say this to depress you. You're like, Gavin, this is the worst take on this psalm ever. I was super encouraged by this psalm, and now you're talking about tufts of grass. We've got buffalo out on the mountain there, and the little remnant that's sitting over Larapinta Drive that we apparently can't get rid of. There's this sense of it's I don't want to depress you with this, right? God is generous, but the abundance that we picture in this psalm, right, would have been such a foreign concept for the writer of this psalm, for the sheep and for the shepherd in the desert. It just would have been a completely foreign concept. It was not what shepherding in the desert was like, because the desert is not a place of abundance, right? The desert is a place of just enough. And so the good shepherd leads his flock day by day through the desert that provides just enough for every day. Right? And I think this is really, really beautiful, because let's be reminded how this psalm began. It said, "The Lord is my shepherd, I have all that I need." And in many respects, this is far more reflective of shepherding in the desert. I have all that I need day by day. The Lord is my shepherd. I have all that I need. There is this contentment. There is this rest. There is security each and every day. You see, when we approach this psalm seeking the experience of rest with this idea of abundance, there is a danger that in times of just enough, we begin to question whether the shepherd is good. Let me just unpack that again. If we approach this psalm with an abundance mentality, in the times of faith that we experience that daily just enough, there is a risk that we start to question whether or not the shepherd is really good. However, when we place this psalm in the desert, which it is where it was written, whether it be in the deserts of our spiritual walk or the physical desert that we have right here with its isolation and challenges and just enough, we start seeing that God is our shepherd today. God is the shepherd that provides just enough for us today. And so when we start to unpack this, we start to understand what it looks like to experience rest in a fresh way. I want to continue through this psalm because there's another couple of shepherding references that I want to pick up on that you may not be familiar with. It says in verse 3, he renews my strength. He guides me along right paths, bringing honor to his name. Has anyone heard a previous translation that refers to this slightly differently? He guides me along paths of righteousness. Is anyone familiar with that? Paths of righteousness? For his name's sake. That's often how it's translated. He guides me along paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Now, this term, paths of righteousness, all right, was actually a shepherding term. It refers to these. You can see those lines across the hillside, and if you go to New Zealand, if you go to places where they have lots of flocks, you'll see these all across the mountain, these paths. They're carved out sideways across the mountain. There are these well-worn, well-beaten tracks that the animals travel along. Of course, they don't travel straight down the hill. They walk along these paths, and these paths were called the paths of righteousness, okay? These are paths that allow sheep to move across the hill rather than go directly down. And I love that this is this kind of everyday shepherding of the sheep, all right? This ever-present reality of the shepherd who guides his sheep in the way that they should go by, again, his voice, right? The deber. Now, I love the fact that when you look at these paths of righteousness, they were already established. Like, they're already established. Like, we see them there. We know where the paths of righteousness are on this particular mountain. And they're reinforced, right, through consistency. As we continue to go over them and over and over them, they become more and more established. Now, from a Jewish perspective, this is a deep reference to Torah, by the way, a deep reference to the paths of righteousness. God has called us to a particular way, and so the idea of being guided along paths of righteousness is like, I will obey Torah. I will work my way through this. But for us today in particular, right, this is about faithfulness to, maybe we could say, the heart of Torah, right, as revealed in Jesus, the Word. The sheep, as Jesus says in John, listen to the direction and the voice of their shepherd. But it's important to be reminded that their direction was not aimless. There were paths of righteousness for them to travel on, and that is what this psalmist referenced. He guides me along these established paths for his name's sake, for his glory. It was always about God's glory. And when we walk those paths that are established, that the shepherd calls us to walk on, it actually brings him glory rather than us. And so it shouldn't be surprising that Jesus picks up on this in John chapter 10. He says, I am the good shepherd. He says, I know my sheep and my sheep know me. Just as the Father knows me and I know the Father, and I lay down my life for the sheep. I have other sheep that are not of this sheep pen. I must bring them also. They too will listen to my voice, and there shall be one flock and one shepherd. I mean, Jesus is doing some pretty profound stuff going on there between kind of Jew and Gentile, but there's, in the midst of all this, you hear that shepherd voice, this connection over and over again to the shepherd who meets people in the desert, who guides them, who speaks to them, and who provides just enough. There's one more reference that I want to make here. It says, verse 4, even when I walk through the dark valley of death, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me. Again, you might have heard this translated slightly different. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. That's the classic translation, isn't it? The valley of the shadow of death. And for many, many decades, if not millennia, people have been capturing that image and using it and go, this is, I'm in the valley of the shadow of death right now. And that's not inappropriate to reference that particular metaphor. But actually, this is indeed another shepherding reference, a very common shepherding reference, okay? And particularly shepherding in the desert. See, the shadow of the valley of death was the place or the situation you find yourself in if you don't get the flock back home before nightfall, right? So if you are a shepherd and you are leading your sheep somewhere and suddenly nightfall comes and you haven't got to your destination in time, to that safe destination in time, you are in the valley of the shadow of death. That's what it was referred to, okay? And I don't know if you've ever been in one of these moments, if we could pick up on that metaphor, where there's this sense of, I am not where I'm supposed to be, or I am not where I planned to be. This is what it's picking up on, the valley of the shadow of death. I'm not where I'm supposed to be, it's not where I planned to be, and yet I find myself here, light is fading, and I might get a little bit of moonlight, but apart from that, this place is risky, okay? Threats are emerging. Maybe it is that in your spiritual walk, you just made an unwise choice and you're like, I'm not where I'm supposed to be. And so you find yourself in the valley of the shadow of death. Maybe you're pursuing a particular possibility and you thought that God was opening a door, but suddenly it slammed closed and you're like, this is not where I'm supposed to be. The valley of the shadow of death. And I've heard in many times, I might even have used it myself, down here in verse 4, this rod and staff being used as a metaphor for discipline and direction. You know, you're the shepherd. You know, sometimes God has to use the rod and sometimes he's got to use the staff and kind of pull you back together. It's actually not what a shepherd would do at all, especially in this particular context, because of course, the shepherd uses his or her voice. The rod and the staff were always about protection. And so it's no surprise that these particular images arise in the context of the valley of the shadow of death. In these times when we need protection, that is what our good shepherd wields. In fact, it's known that while a flock was in the valley of the shadow of death, instead of walking behind the group of sheep, right, and calling out instructions, or walking in front of the sheep and calling them forward, what the shepherd would do was actually stand in the middle of the flock and have the flock essentially surround them as they walk. When you suddenly understand that image of the shepherd in the middle of the sheep, all these words make sense. I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Like God is right there in the middle of the sheep, in the valley of the shadow of death, where we're not supposed to be, where we are. I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me. Your rod and your staff protect and comfort me. It's a beautiful image. Because in these times of darkness, the good shepherd stands in the middle. And this is what the psalmist wants to pick up on. You see, some people tonight, as they consider what it means to understand God as the good shepherd, need to understand that God is not, in your context, the one who is standing behind calling out instructions from a distance. Actually, for some people here tonight, maybe you need to know that God is standing right there in the middle of the flock, nice and close. I feel like this psalm reminds us that there's nowhere that we can run in order to escape God's presence, whether you found trouble or trouble found you. And really, before I wrap up, this is what I wanted us to do tonight, is just to re-examine this really familiar psalm. To look at these words afresh and be reminded that the Lord is our shepherd and we have everything that we need for today. And maybe the translators pushed the green pastures and the flowing waters a little bit too far. But our God is the one who provides just enough for each day. I mean, we live here in Alice. I feel like I'm not alone in maybe experiencing this, right? Maybe we crave that abundance from time to time, but actually what God wants for us is to trust that He'll provide just enough. And that's rest and that confidence is what He wants to stir within us. And I recognize that tonight I've just looked at the kind of the first 2/3, you know, God's going to prepare a table in the presence of my enemies. There's like so much going on there too. Like seriously, are the enemies invited to the meal? Oh, some pretty provocative stuff there, right? But tonight's about understanding the shepherd heart of God. And again, like with all these psalms, we allow it to speak afresh, particularly for those of us in the desert, just as the author David was. Maybe it is that we can see and have our experience of God as our shepherd reshaped in a different way. So as a way of finishing up, sorry, I've gone to the wrong slide. I'm just going to thank you. As a way of finishing up, I want us to share in the Psalms Project clip from Psalm 23. The way that it's framed up is Yahweh is my shepherd. That's how they title it. And I want us to just sit and listen to this psalm. And again, allow these words to speak over us in our context, particularly for those of us who maybe are feeling tired. We know the reality of the desert, and we need the shepherd who understands that desert too. And my question is, in which of these characteristics do you need to find rest in tonight? Is it the shepherd who provides just enough? Just enough. Is it the shepherd who leads with his voice in the desert? Or is it the shepherd who moves to the middle? In the valley of the shadow of death, you are there with me. Your rod and staff comfort and protect me. Which of these do you need to be reminded of tonight as you find rest? So let's just take a moment. We're going to listen to this song. It goes for about 3 minutes. It picks up on Psalm 23 and what God wants to speak to us through it.
Yahweh is my shepherd. I have everything I need. Yahweh is my shepherd. I have everything I need. Everything I need. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the quiet waters. He restores my soul. He restores my soul. He leads me in paths of righteousness for the sake of his name. Even though I walk through the darkest of valleys, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. You're always with me. Your rod and staff, they give me peace. They comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and your love will follow and pursue me. Your love will chase me down all of my days, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Forever.
And so, God, as our good shepherd, would you meet us in the desert? Would you provide? Would you guide? Would we celebrate who you are and find rest in you? Amen.